another episode of the LitRPG Podcast. I'm Ramon Mejia. I'm here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course author interviews for episode 36 of the podcast. Now in new releases and reviews this week, talking about six new titles that have come out this week, including Lion's Quest, Duel, Wield, Press X to Loot, The Scout of Artemis, Alpha World Book 1, Gamer for Life, A Player in the Greenwood, also Project Phoenix Book 1, Jacked In, and Spetsnaz, a Permadeath LitRPG LitFPS series, formerly of the 49er series. We're going to begin our show, though, of course, with LitRPG news. And in LitRPG news, we're going to begin with the wonderful news that Adventures on Terra is out as an audiobook. Yes, I'm super jazzed about this. For those of you who don't know, I'm the guy who wrote that. R.A. Mejia is actually me, Ramon Mejia. And after a lot of really hard work on the part of the narrator and, going back and forth, it's finally available for download and for people to listen to. And now you, at home, can hear all the voices that have been running around in my brain the entire time that I've been writing this thing. It's really cool to hear somebody narrate the book, in all honesty. So if you want to go check it out, I'd appreciate it. But please, whether you like it or not, go leave a review. That way other people can find the wonderful gem that I believe is Adventures on Terra. Thanks a lot. I'm going to play a little sample for you real quick, give you a taste of what it sounds like and how great of a job the narrator Jill Smith does.
When I focus above the troll's head, a box appears. Grumph, level 8. As the troll approaches the entrance to the kobold lair, I step out into the open with my shield and spear ready. I face the creature. He stops and looks at me with confusion on his face.
You know, little lizard. Who you?
I raise my spear, now with the sharpest point I have, and shout loud and clear, I'm Armand the Magnificent, the defender of these kobolds. I have fought wargs and torn the horns from my enemies' skulls. I'm here to destroy you, vile beast.
You gonna tell him those horns were from rabbits?
Mary whispers to me. No, now be quiet. You're ruining my moment. The troll looks even more confused and scratches his rear with the tree.
He's a troll. They're not exactly known as great thinkers. You have to say it plain and simple.
Sighing, I yell at Grumph, I'm here to kill you.
And of course you can listen to a much larger sample. You can listen to the whole thing, heck, if you want to. We'll have a link on the show notes for the Audible link to Adventures on Terra, Book 1 Beginnings. And actually I'm going to have an interview with the narrator of the audiobook, Jill Smith, and I'm going to be putting out next week as episode 37 of the podcast. It's actually really cool. We talk about how she got into narrating. She's also a writer, so she actually has dual viewpoints and a lot of different things. Really cool interview. Definitely check it out when it comes out next week. Okay, on to other LitRPG news. Robert Bevan, author of the Critical Failure series, was a guest on the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast. It's actually a really cool podcast. He's the third LitRPG author to be on the podcast, and it was really fun to watch him talk about his stories and writing in a niche genre. So go check it out. We'll have a link in the show notes. Also, in Travis Backwell news, he has put out the first three fully edited chapters of Awaken Online Precipice, which is the second book in his series, on his Patreon. Now, anyone can go there and read the preface and chapter 1, but only his supporters at the $10 a month level will have access to chapter 2 right now. And Travis does plan to release new chapters every single week on his Patreon until the official release of the new book on March 31st. So if you can't wait till the 31st, you just got to get those chapters now. You go support him. I mean, you should support him anyways because he's a really good author, and it's always good to support authors that you like. We'll have a link in the show notes, of course, for his Patreon page. Okay, in other news, Michael Chatfield, author of the Marilia series, Marilia, has given some tentative release dates for the next books in his series. Book 4, New Horizons, is going to be out on the 28th of March. And Book 5, This Is Our Land, is going to be out on the 25th of April. Tentatively. So it looks like his schedule is going to be end of the month releases, assuming everything goes okay. But he's already has plans for book 5 already, and I'm personally just still struggling with book 2 of my series. I'm about half-ish way through that, Mike. So his writing schedule is a lot better than mine is. Additionally, Difficult Legendaries books 1 and 2, which is a LitRPG series, is out as a bundle package right now. I had issues with book 1 in that series. Book 2 is a little bit better, but if you were interested in getting them, they're available on Amazon as a bundle. Okay, on the cover art for J.A. Cipriano's next book, Soulstone Skeleton King, has been revealed. And, of course, release date of March the 9th, 2017. So it'll be out next week. Now, I liked book 1. It had some issues with some game logic. But if you can ignore that stuff, it was really kind of fun. I gave it a 7 out of 10 when I read the first book. But again, I had some issues that you can read the full review, of course, at our website at geekbypodcast.com or litrpgpodcast.com. Okay, Christopher Kinney has announced the sequel to his novel, Stuck in a Game, and he also has some cover art for the book. His release date is going to be March the 10th, so next week as well. There's so many things coming out next week and this week. The first book, Stuck in a Game, got a 6 out of 10 for me. It is about the story of a young man and his girlfriend who got in a car accident. They both get brain damage and hooked up to a dream-based virtual reality system to help their brains recover. So he's this from the point of view of the main character, Noah. He wakes suddenly, he's in this virtual reality game, and it explained to him that he's stuck there basically while his brain recovers. But if he dies in the game, he might fall into an irreversible coma. And then, of course, there's some drama and some intrigue in the background with the Rogue Game Company. And again, it was a pretty decent Stuck in a Game story. There were, of course, some game mechanic issues. There generally are, but like I said, it wasn't horrible. Slightly better than average. Now, book 2, in this case, back in the game, Noah survived everything. His body's on the road to recovery. He eventually got out of the game. He got unstuck, but he can't put past him the knowledge that the game company that ruined his life has escaped justice, and he goes back into the game to help his friends recover the evidence he needs to bring justice to that company. So that's the synopsis for book 2, back in the game. Okay, on to some of the LitRPG news. Oh, Audible, audiobook news. Pre-orders are available for The Phantom Castle, which is the 4th book in the Way of the Shaman series, and Way of the Outcast, which is book 3 in Mirror World. And they're going to be available on May the 7th, but you can pre-order them now. We'll have links in the show notes, of course. And that's all the LitRPG news, folks. Pretty sweet. Okay, out now. I'm gonna there's literally 11, 12 books that came out this week. I didn't have time to read them all, much less review them. If I had just rushed it, I wouldn't be doing them justice and giving them a fair review. So I have 6 books that I'm reviewing this week. These ones also came out that I'm going to list, but I'm going to be reviewing them next week on the podcast. That includes For the Guild, which is the 3rd book in the Morelli series. The Dungeon's Child, that's book 3 in the Slime Dungeon Chronicles. Sufficiently Advanced Magic, the Arcane Ascension, book 1. And I'm not really sure if this is actually LitRPG. I read the description. It seems like it might be, or at least have elements that correspond with our genre. I'm not sure. I'm going to read it. I'm going to let you guys know. Also, out this week, Goblin, a LitRPG novel, Tower of Gates. And it's out this week. We're reviewing it next week, though. And Glitch Fiends. This is going to be out on March the 1st. And it's the 2nd book in the Hell's Glitch book. This is the one that reminded me of the, I forget what it's called now. Never mind. It's a kind of a horror, darker story. I'm going to be reviewing it next week. Okay, now on to upcoming LitRPG, when I tell you the stuff that's coming out in the near future for March and April. This includes Soulstone Skeleton King, March the 9th, The Crystal Sphere out March the 10th, Back in Game March the 10th, Shadows of the Great Forest, book 4 in the Realm of Archon series, March the 14th, New Horizons, that's book 4 in the Aurelia series, out March the 28th, Awaken Online Precipice, March the 31st. And these are supposed to come out in March, but they have no actual solid release dates. Delver's LLC Obligations Incurred, Earth Tactics Advance Volume 1, Soul Link Origin, all set in March at some point. Now on to April's releases. This Is Our Land is going to be out on April the 25th. That's book 5 in the Immarillia series. And then Dominion of Blades is also supposed to come out sometime in April. So there you go. Those are your releases that are coming up for March and April. On to new releases and reviews. Okay, and new releases and reviews. Again, we have 6 books. This is going to kind of make the podcast a little bit longer than normal. And then at the very end of that, I actually have kind of a soapbox thing I wanted to talk about, but I'll get to it at the very end of all the stuff. First, the review for Lion's Quest Duel Wield by Michael Scott Earl. This is 828 pages, $7.49. It is not available on Kindle Unlimited, folks, so I'm very sorry for that. Full disclosure, I got an advanced review copy, but purchased it once it got released. That's right, I paid the full $7.50 for this novel, and I'm not sorry about it. You have to remember, folks, that for a lot of people, this price is really expensive. But you also have to remember that this is over 800 pages. And as a general rule of thumb, when I'm buying Kindle books, I look for about a penny a page as far as the cost goes. So this more than meets that my particular criteria for a good value. But for a lot of people, it's just too expensive, especially if it's not on Kindle Unlimited. They just basically can't afford it. You can buy 2 other LitRPG novels for about the same price. So I understand that, but like I said, it's really good. Although the last 5% of the novel is a preview of the author's other series, the Destroyer series, which isn't bad either. Okay, just to refresh your mind, book 1, entitled Undefeated, we're introduced to Leo the Lion. He's a champion fighter in a virtual reality game. He's recruited to test a full immersion fantasy VR game that's indistinguishable from reality. Only someone is willing to kill him to stop him. That's the premise of book 1. A lot of adventure stuff in there. Probably the biggest complaint a lot of reviewers had with the story was there's an elf bunny character that is kind of hypersexualized. She returns in book 2, but she's toned down a lot. Like a lot. And she doesn't show up for most of the story. She basically takes the place of like a comedy relief, but also as a character that he comes to care about as a sister. But again, the hypersexuality is really toned down, and it's more done for joke purposes in book 2. Okay, now in book 2, the premise is very similar. Leo Lennox goes back into the full immersion VR game Anacrypt, and he has to try and secure the first relic in the game. Now in book 2, it's just Anacrypt. In book 1, there was like the old game he was playing, which was a competitive fighting game with older virtual reality tech. But in this one, it's just the new game all the time. It starts out, the first 25% of the book is kind of a recap mode of reminding you what happened in the story, what's the plotline, why people are trying to kill Leo. Reintroducing all the characters, does it very well, and also reintroduces the virtual reality world. And it also establishes that this is an action-oriented story. Like right from the get-go, bam, action, bullets flying, people trying to kill him trying to save his parents, all the good stuff. From the very beginning, lots of action. So it is a really good time there. Now, I have to note that there's a lot less time spent in the world in Duel Wield than there was in Undefeated, which is one of the few things that I didn't like about book 1. Not that the world stuff was not done well or written well or interesting. I just don't like staying in the world. I read LitRPG because of the virtual reality game world, or the game world, not because of the world. I'm in the world enough, But in book 2, almost 80% of the time is spent in the game world, which is a huge improvement over about the 50-50-ness of the last book. So big plus there. And most of the time in the world is actually dedicated to kind of reminding the reader about the fundamental reason why Leo is doing all this. It's to take care of his parents and to help get them a treatment for their Alzheimer's. So it helps reestablish the motivation for the character's actions. It's a good job there. Now, once Leo is back in the game, again, he stays there like 80% of the time. He pops out occasionally, but most of the time is spent in Anacrypt, and that world is a lot more fleshed out in book 2. In book 1, that was the other issue I had is that the first virtual reality game, which is that competitive fighting game, was really detailed and like it was interesting and nice, even if it felt a little more, touch based and not as full immersion. I understood it, but in Anacrypt it was a very much a less fleshed out story in book one, and in book two that is remedied almost completely. There are interesting features. They use like this really big city, and it's really well described. I can picture it in my mind finally. There's an expansion of how the game mechanics work. Game mechanics work in Anacrypt. There are large cities to explore. There's a explanation of the history of the world and that city in particular, and other geographical locations and how cultures intermingle. New races are introduced. There's an adventurers guild, dungeons to explore, and some great new fun characters in book two. And overall, it was a much better experience. I had a really great time reading the novel. I devoured it in a couple days, which is, considering it's 800 pages, that's really good. And it improves on an already good series to me. And so for me, Lion's Quest Duel gets a 9 out of 10. I think that's the first time I've ever given anyone a 9 out of 10, to be honest. And it's mostly because it was good and it got better. So I fully look forward to reading everything in this series. So there you go. That's Lion's Quest Duel Wield. Okay, next story. Press X to loot. The Scout of Artemis. Written by Greg Horlock. This is 425 pages, 99 cents, available on Kindle Unlimited. He always puts his books at like 99 cents, which makes them an amazing deal. There's really no reason not to pick this thing up. It's on Kindle Unlimited based on the price alone. It's a good pickup. Greg Horlock is the author of the Difficult Legendary series. Now this story, it had some issues, but for the price, I'm like, even with those issues, I'd say pick it up. I mean, it's 99 cents. The story is the story of Chris. He joins the latest virtual reality game for a chance to win the money he needs to save his family's business cards. Now all he has to do is find one little item called Helder's Bane. Only his group is competing against other better equipped players. They have to fight vicious monsters and have to survive all that the game throws at them. And survive is the key. Now, the first 15% of the novel is honestly a lot of background information in the real world. Again, this is kind of a recurring theme with me. Even at 15%, it's a little too much time spent in the real world. I feel like that the same things could have been accomplished in a much shorter time span, and we could have spent more time in the game world. But most of the time is spent doing a really good job of establishing an emotional connection to the main character, setting up why he has to play the game to save the family business, why he needs a financial backer. It establishes the motivations for the character. And again, it does a good job of doing all that stuff, especially like hinting at the secret ability of the main character that lets him, win. But again, it went on just a little too long for my taste. I feel like it could have been shorter. And again, that's another common issue with the reviewers from Amazon. They kind of state the same thing. But once you get into the game world, the pace of the story really does pick up quite a bit. Don't judge this book by the cover art. That cover art doesn't do it justice. This is more of a survival story than it is like this 8-bit adventure, which is great to me. I liked the survival aspects of it. I liked the survival aspect of it. When the characters get into the game, they have to create shelter, fire, weapons, special items that they need. So there's a lot of crafting, but there's also that element of just you against the game world. And all the things around you. Every night monsters spawn and you have to build a camp to survive the wave of monsters. And I like that aspect of it. It was very unique, very interesting. Big plus for me. Also, another thing I liked about the story, the limited skill slots in the story made choosing skills much more important for the characters. They basically start out with four skill slots, 2 primary, 2 secondary. And any of the skills they happen to find, if those slots are already filled, they're just out of luck. They can't get them. So they have to be kind of selective. So every character has a chance to be unique, even though they have the same base classes of, thief, ranger, whatever, barbarian, crafter, whatever. Because they can only choose those 4 spots, they have an opportunity to create some very interesting and unique, builds, which I like the fact that occurs. 3, base building. Again, even though it's a small part of the story, I really like the characters can build a shelter, set up traps, and it has special runes that give them bonuses to fend off the waves of monsters that appear every night. Those are the things I really liked about the story, and I felt they were unique and well done and made it feel special. Now, there are some things I didn't enjoy about the story that I thought could have been done better. One, self-generating quest. This is kind of a weird game mechanic that I felt like could have just been exploited entirely by the game characters. There's a weird mechanic in the story that lets players generate their own quests by thinking hard about them. And it just felt kind of weird in that why didn't they exploit it? If you're hungry for XP, why not just create a bunch of quests for everything you need to do? Want to make dinner? Make a quest. Want to walk down the street? Quest it. Got to use the bathroom? Double XP quest, which in these stories is really challenging because they never talk about restroom stuff. It's like, in a virtual reality world, do you still have to use the restroom? And if so, you should get double XP for it. My opinion. Some other things I didn't care for in the story: the predictable and unmemorable villains. I mean, gee golly, you took the time to name them, but they're not interesting. I mean, and they don't really have to be. Like, the game world itself is almost the bigger villain in the story, and that it's trying to kill the characters every single night. But the villains that pop up there, the other team is showing, looking for Helder's Bane. They're super rich, but they really never get any time in the story that makes them anything other than just like a vague reason why the characters have to advance. And that to me was like kind of a wasted opportunity. Also, later on in the story, there are some really convenient ways that the characters get exactly what they need to advance the plot. I mean, especially in the last 25%. But even a little before that, the character needs something to complete a quest or advance a story, and it just seriously magically appears. Hit that magical barrier. Oh look, a witch just happens to show up and can fix that for you. You need a map. Oh, one of the characters settling rumors where he heard about getting one. Hey, wait, a plot to change what you thought you needed to finish the quest? Oh look, someone magically appears that tells you exactly where to go to get it. I mean, these are just kind of story issues for me that kind of took away from what I had enjoyed previously, because it really happens a lot in like the last 25%. And that brings me to the last thing I really didn't care for was the rushed pace of the last 25%. It feels like the author either lost interest in the story or just wanted a better, grander, epic ending. And it just feels so rushed and almost unrelated. It almost feels like it's a short story that was written the same way and it's kind of tacked on at the end to make it feel a little more epic. And it almost everything that I liked about the first 75% disappears in that last 25%. And it didn't make sense because there's little to no foreshadowing of the things happening in the last 25% in the first 75. So it felt disconnected to me. So overall, I really did enjoy the story. But the rushed ending and convenient story points at the very end really lessened the overall score for me. So it's going to get a 6 out of 10 for me. And it would have gotten better, but, you know, there were issues. But again, for 99 cents, it's still a really good deal. Okay, on to Alpha World, Book 1, Gamer for Life, written by Daniel Schinhofen. Okay, this is 403 pages, $3.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Again, full disclosure, I got a review copy, but I picked it up on Kindle Unlimited once it was actually released. It's written by, again, Daniel Schinhofen. He's the author of the Last Horizon books, which is a really character-driven, emotionally evocative story as a LitRPG story. I really enjoyed that series. It made me cry at the very end. I had really good expectations of the story. Now, the kind of synopsis of this is that Seamus is a convict who chooses to serve a life term in a virtual reality world instead of a life term in prison. His character's name is Alberet. He's a summoner. There's no mission to save the world. These are really just the chronicled adventures of a man who now has to live in a virtual world. He fights monsters, makes friends, finds some lovers, and figures out how to best use his class abilities to tame the snarky demons he can summon. So that's kind of my synopsis of the story. Now, just as a heads up to anybody who's watching and considering purchasing this, towards the end of the novel, there are some very, very steamy sensual scenes that some may consider to be mild erotica. So I know some people just aren't into that at all, and I don't want you to be surprised going into the story when it appears. I'll give you like about the percentage notifications like when it happens later on. Now, I really enjoyed about 80% of this novel a lot, which I'll talk about first. The author has a great talent for creating characters with depth, interesting backstories, internal conflicts, distinct personalities. That's kind of the thing I loved about the other series. And the same thing I loved about this series the most is the characters themselves and the relationships between characters. Those are the highlights of the story, whether they're romantic relationships, friendly, enemies, whatever it is. Those are the things that drew me into the story. I feel connected to the characters. I want them to be happy, and when bad things happen to them, I'm genuinely sad. And I think that's a very unique talent that not everybody has, and I think that's a strong suit. Now, there is action in the story. There's fights galore, but they're not amazing. They're okay. They're not like bad or anything. They fight skeletons, goblins, orcs, and that's kind of it. And they kind of cycle a little bit. Like they fight the goblins a couple times, they fight the orcs a couple times, and you know it feels a little repetitive occasionally, and it feels very technically described. Like when he's describing characters in the relationships, there's a lot of depth there. When he's describing action, not so much. Like it's technically accurate. Like all the things he does, it feels very game-like. Like he's played a bunch of video games, and that's how he describes it to the group. Like actual actions. He was like, oh, swing left, hit him with, this power, whatever. And there's a bunch of technical language there, but it doesn't feel as descriptive as the time it takes for the characters. And that doesn't make it bad. It just, it makes it okay. Okay. Another thing I kind of liked is, this is something I don't want to say no, I liked it. It was cool. But I know it's not for everybody. There's lots of flirting from the main character with a few other players and even one non-player character. There were some very sensual scenes involving massages, showers, baths that just, gave me the vapors. But I know it's not for everybody. These scenes appear at the 62% mark and then a little more through the last 25% of the novel. Now, there is sex in the story, but it's mostly fade to black variety. It's not particularly graphic, with the exception like one little small scene near the end. And the sex and these kind of central scenes make sense in the story and ultimately do a really big reveal later on. So it's not just there for titillation's sake. It's not there just to shock people. It makes sense within the context of the story. But again, it's not for everybody, obviously. So I'm letting you know where it does appear, so you can choose either to skip it or to just not pick up the book, whichever choice suits you. Now, there are a couple parts that I didn't enjoy as much. That other 20% of the story. One, I'm like, this is just like a silly game thing for me. The main character gets not one, but two scaling items very early in the story. And I'm like, okay, that seems a little much, even for me. Like, I understand that you want to make your character interesting and give them some unique abilities. But I'm like, those items just don't appear for like early characters. One thing. It's just small. It doesn't really distract from the story. It's just like, oh my gosh. That was my thought when I read it. There is like one game mechanic that seemed a little bit weird, in that the main character is able to use unarmed combat techniques like a weird chokehold without any type of connecting in-game skill, which seems to be a disconnect because the main character is a summoner. And so he focuses on intelligence and wisdom, yet he consistently is able to defeat trained non-player character guards and soldiers who presumably have better stats invested in strength, agility, and constitution. And again, it's a small thing. It just strikes me as a little bit inconsistent. Like, it makes sense within the story in that he's a former guard, so he has these skills. It just doesn't make sense in that those skills shouldn't transfer directly to his character because the stats don't match and he doesn't have like a skill for it. It's my gamer brain. But it's not a huge deal, but it stuck out to me. And again, the last 25% of the story kind of turns into the central harem-ish story with occasional breaks for combat and leveling. And again, it's not for everybody, obviously. And it got a little bit repetitive even to me. And in the end, I didn't really like the end. I mean, there's this big reveal and it's just like the end. And I'm like, wait, that's it? So those are the things I didn't care for the story. Overall, it's really fine. This story is definitely more crunchy I guess that's the term than his last series. There were more class descriptions. There were definitely numbers and levels and skill descriptors in this story than there is in his last one. So that was really cool. But the ending just felt a little bit flat. Wasn't as satisfying as I was hoping it was going to be. And then the reveal and then the end kind of knocked a point off to me. So, but I still give Alpha World Book 1 Gamer for Life a 7 out of 10. So it's still enjoyable for me. Okay, on to number 3, or 4. I think it's 4. Yeah, book number 4. A Player in the Greenwood by Galen Wolfe. Okay, this is a short story, 147 pages, $2.99, available on Kindle Unlimited. Written again by Galen Wolfe, author of the sci-fi series Wolf Cyborg. This is the story of an inexperienced player hanging around a player versus player zone in a fantasy virtual reality MMO. He gets killed, he's forced to give up his hard-earned gear, and at first he rage quits, and then he instead decides to re-roll a character as a ranger, becoming powerful enough to get his revenge against the unknown assailant and to solve a mysterious Easter egg quest. That's his goal. He wants to become, this is a revenge story at the beginning as the premise. Now, this novella does a really good job of introducing and explaining the game mechanics of the virtual reality game world succinctly. This is really key because it is a short story. I was really impressed by how quickly and how efficiently the author explained how the game world works, how the characters level, skills, abilities. It was done very well, I have to say. The author does this through direct explanation, the characters talking to himself, and also through actions of the characters, things that are actually done. Now you can actually tell that the author spent a lot of time playing actual MMOs. There's just way too much gamer speak, too many details to just been researched. Like this stuff has to be lived in part to be this accurate and interesting and descriptive. Now, I'm personally not a huge fan of the revenge premise, but I understand that every story has to have a place to start, and that the main character has to have a flaw that he has to improve by the end of the story, especially when it's something this short. So I get that. It's not my particularly favorite premise. Now, the beginning of the story really reads like fan fiction for the massively multiplayer online game Dungeons and Dragons Online, and that's not necessarily bad. A lot of the game mechanics, adventure settings, classes, their abilities are direct pulls from that game, at least in the beginning. And again, this isn't bad. I like that game a lot. I spent many hours playing as a Drow Sorcerer and a Wordforged Artificer there, and so it kind of injects at the very start kind of a sense of nostalgia for like a game that I really enjoyed a lot. So I like that aspect of it personally. But from there, it very quickly diverges in creating its own world. It creates a lot of unique game mechanics on its own, skill sets that make it feel a lot more unique, including, especially the poison and counter poison system between the poison and herbalism skills in the game. It kind of directly ties into the player versus player combat of the story, and kind of highlights the human skill involved. Have complex thought processes and strategies of their own. And that was the major part of this story, this system where as your character's level, he has access to new poisons and new counter poisons. And it's like this game of, cat and mouse between the two things in player versus player combat. And while some of the poisons are definitely overpowered, like the one that makes you follow one order from the poisoner, OP, definitely. I understand that it's necessary to further the plot, but I didn't like some of the overpoweredness of some of the poison. They just didn't seem balanced within a real, game. Now, eventually in the story, there were guilds, there are player versus player experiences, there are guild battles, as the main character levels and tries to solve the Easter egg puzzle and get his revenge, of course, against that guy who killed him once and took his stuff. And towards the end, there are definitely some, I think they're called plot coupons, where the main character just happens to level and get just the right ability to complete the task, and that happens a couple times in the story towards the end. But it wasn't such a huge deal that it dropped me to the realism of the story or broke immersion at all. Overall, this is not epic fiction, of course. It's just a fun story. It kind of reminded me of like watching YouTube videos about people playing MMOs, and that's all it intends to be. It says at the very beginning, this is a novella, LitRPG short story. and that's all it is. That's all it claims to be, and it accomplishes that very well. A player in Greenwood gets a nice 7 out of 10 for me. Okay, on to Project Phoenix #1, Jacked In. This is written by N.A.K. Baldwin. Okay, this is definitely a short story. 40 pages, $2.99, available on Kindle Unlimited. N.A. Baldwin is the author of the urban fantasy series Ether Walker. So he comes from a different genre initially, and this is his first attempt at writing a LitRPG story. And unfortunately, there are some big issues for me with this particular story. I'll talk about the premise of the story first. The story starts with Jack in a game with a spaceship struggling to make enough money to pay his daily space bills. It then shifts back in time to tell the story of how he got there. Now, like I said, I enjoyed reading the story. The writing had a few grammar errors and spelling errors, but nothing that took me out of the story. It, however, is not LitRPG. It can be called video game fiction. It can be called sci-fi, but it is most definitely not LitRPG. And that's sad to me because it says in the title, a LitRPG series. So there was definitely some disappointment there. And again, I want to remind you folks at home how I qualify LitRPG. They're not a list of things. I mean, there's not like a ton of them. 2 things though. It has to be set in a world, a game world, or in a world with obvious game mechanics. And again, the obviously stated parts is kind of the big issue for a lot of writers. In this story, there are no obviously stated game mechanics. I mean, there are, but they limit themselves to like some brackets around some item names and some casual references to maybe some character traits. But they're not. That's it. I mean, in 40 pages, I would have liked to have seen something that describes this as more game mechanic. I mean, a level, a rank, a weapon description, damage notifications, experience points. None of that exists. And that's unfortunate. That's one of the big things about LitRPG that I love, is understanding the game world that exists. If I can roll a character in that game world, if I can design my own character, bam, you probably accomplished it as LitRPG. Now, 2, the second thing that qualifies as LitRPG, to me, if nobody else, is that the character grows in power according to those game world mechanics. And again, it didn't happen here. He got some money, he got some weapons. That's kind of it. No level ups, no ranks, no skills. None of that happened. And so, not LitRPG. It's that simple. And again, the extent of the story is that it's great video game story. It's a great virtual reality fiction. But that's not what LitRPG is, unfortunately. Now, what really makes this frustrating to me is the fact that I talked to the author. He messaged me. We had a nice chat. He says he plans to make this a weekly serial release, and I hope that it gets more LitRPG-ish. He said he actually took the time to plan out the game mechanics and story and to do a bunch of number crunching. It's just that it doesn't show in the story, which is super frustrating, because if you do the work, but you don't put it in where we can see it, it's not LitRPG. So there it is. That's it. It gets, unfortunately, a 4 out of 10 for me. So below meh. Just because it says it's LitRPG and it's not. So there you go. But I plan to read the next story, give it another chance. If it improves, great. I really do hope that it does well. It's just not LitRPG. So sorry, Project Phoenix. Okay, on to our last story. Finally, folks, I know it's a long episode. Spetsnaz, a Permadeath LitRPG LitFPS series written by Matthew Sylvester. Okay, it is 131 pages, $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Also, full disclosure, got an advance copy, read it on Kindle Unlimited once it actually came out. Okay, unfortunately, this one has a very similar review to the last one for very similar reasons. The first novel in this series, it had these issues where it was LitRPG, definitely. But the game mechanics and the LitRPG stuff felt forced, and it felt sprinkled in very occasionally, mostly towards the end of the story. And it felt forced. And I kind of reflected that in my review. I kind of gave it a pass because I thought, okay, this is his first time writing LitRPG. He wants to introduce things slowly. It'll get better in the second book. And in this is it. This is the second book, and it doesn't get better. It gets worse. as far as that goes. There are even fewer game mechanics described. There's fewer LitRPG stuff. Like one of the few game mechanics described in book 2 is DP, development points, and it doesn't seem to do anything. It's not really used. It's awarded after kills. There are really no evident game mechanics and no progression of the characters. So again, not LitRPG, and that makes me sad because this is a well-written story. There's lots of military sci-fi action. If you like book 1, if you've read it, you're gonna like book 2. It's good. It's not poorly written. Good action scenes, lots of fighting, combat. But as a LitRPG story, none of that's there, and it's disappointing because again, the author I've talked to him, he says he has item descriptions, he has these game mechanics in the story, but for whatever reason he chose not to include them in this. And maybe he felt like the game mechanic stuff disrupted the flow of the story. It took people out of the immersion level a bit, and that's fine. If that's the story you want to write, go do it. Like I said, this is not a bad story, not badly written, I should say. But don't put LitRPG in the title if it's not going to be a LitRPG story. That when that happens, part of me feels kind of deceived. And again, I'm not saying that's the intention of the author. I'm saying that that's how I feel when I read this kind of stuff. When I'm expecting a LitRPG story and it doesn't occur, part of me is like, oh, that sucks. And it's really super disappointing. So again, Spetsnaz gets a 4 out of 10 for the same reason that the last one did. Now LitRPG. And because this is the second book in the series, and it happened in the first one as well, to a degree, I'm going to drop the series from my review schedule, so I won't be reviewing book 3 or 4 or 5, whatever it is. And that's unfortunately just the way it goes. It's not LitRPG. So there you go. Okay, that's all the books for the series for the long episode, folks. I have one short little bit, which is kind of a soapbox moment. Just my opinion on serial short stories in general, just because I've seen this again week after week after week. I've really noticed a trend of writers writing short fiction, calling it LitRPG, and it not actually being LitRPG. And it usually feels like authors are testing the water to see if they can write in the genre, or if they see they have enough of an understanding of what LitRPG means. And unfortunately, they just don't end up being LitRPG because they're pulling from their original genres they're writing in, and they're not really understanding what things need to be in LitRPG to make it LitRPG. And it turns into video game fiction or sci-fi or fantasy, whatever the case is. And it's usually not bad storytelling. It's not bad writing at all. That's never my criticism of it. It's usually a case of there aren't game mechanics. There aren't character progression according to the game mechanics. Or those game mechanics are just hidden in the background, and that's not what LitRPG is. All this stuff has to be up front. It has to be there. You can't not talk about those things. It's really important. Now understand that short serial stories are challenging. They're short by their very nature, so authors have to be selective of what they include. But you can't skip that LitRPG stuff. And again, just 2 guidelines, man. It's set in a game world or world with game-like mechanics that are obviously stated. 2, character progression according to the game mechanics in obviously stated ways. And all that really means is that all that cool world building stuff, all those numbers you crunch, all those, character descriptions, item descriptions, damage notifications, has to be there. It has to be stated plainly and obviously. No vagueness, no illusions, just clear statements. You have to think of the game world as a character you have to define clearly, that you have to make understandable. You have to make it interesting to the readers. It can't just be a thing in the background where the characters happen to exist and things happen. So that's just the part of LitRPG. The game world is like a character. And again, I understand that it's hard for authors to give themselves permission, especially if they're coming from genres where this stuff is not okay, whether it's fantasy, sci-fi, whatever it is, romance, thrillers, whatever. I understand that in those genres, you show, you don't tell. You can't show these things. But in LitRPG, it's okay to show damage notifications. It's okay to show level up messages, skill descriptions, ranks, cultivation essences, whatever. All that stuff that you are used to putting behind the scenes, put it up front. It's not immersion breaking for most of us. For me especially, these are the things that I love. I love the fact that in a good LitRPG story, I can create my own character with their own stats, with their own abilities, whatever it is, because I know enough about how that game world works. And if I can do that, you've probably accomplished making your story lit RPG. You know, so and people, and I understand some people don't like that stuff, but again, they just kind of skip over it when they're reading. So it's better to include it than to not. And again, I'm not criticizing authors. Write the story that you want to write. Just don't label it lit RPG if you don't have this stuff in it. Okay, that's it. If you want some great examples of lit RPG stories that I thought were really done well, I'd go read the Reborn series or the Oak Shield Junction series. They're good stories, and they're serialized stories, but they do a really good job of describing their worlds up front. And even the one that I talked about today, it did a really good job of just describing the game mechanics very succinctly. That was done very well. Okay, but that's it for me. That's me off my soapbox. Take my advice or my opinion as what it's worth. I do this on a really regular basis, and these criticisms keep coming up because authors aren't understanding some of the things that make lit RPG so special and unique and fun. But if you do it well, you can have some amazing success. I mean, there have been a lot of other authors who have written stories that have just done amazing bestseller work because they understand what is wanted by the genre readers. So there you go. That's it. I swear. That's it, everyone. If you enjoyed the podcast, you want to support us, if you want to support me, remember you can sign up for the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. There are tons of ways to support the podcast. You can find them all at litrpgpodcast.com/support. Thanks for hanging out with me today. It was a long episode. It's going to be a long episode next week too when I review another 7 or 8 books. So just as an FYI. But until we can hang out again, everyone, remember to go read some more RPG. Goodbye, everyone.